Hello and welcome to the Sega Guys podcast, the show where sometimes we really do take ages to be good. I'm Dan the Mega Driver, and today I'm joined not only by my friend and co-host James the Segaholic, but the Lord and Saviour of Sega content himself. We welcome Mr. Sega Lord X to the pod. Mel, welcome to the show. How you doing, mate?
I'm doing great, man. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks for joining us. It's obviously we've been long-time fans, viewers of your content for the longest time, and yeah, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. So, what have you been up to? Any new pickups, or what have you been playing?
Oh, actually, for the Sega Lord X content I've been doing on YouTube, I have built a Windows 98 PC to run old Sega PC games. And let me tell you, that has been an adventure and a half because I have I have not messed with Windows 98 for 20 plus years. And going back to that and setting that up and getting those games up and running has been a nightmare, let me tell you. I mean, holy hell, guys. I mean, going back and playing some of that stuff really makes you appreciate Steam and just pressing play to get the damn game running, you know? Because, oh, I have run into so many issues. We don't support this sound card. We don't support this video card. Oh, you don't have Direct 3D hardware. You have the wrong DirectX. I mean, oh my God, man. It's just one issue after another.
It just shows how far we've come with PC, because PCs today, it's here on social media and people that prefer to play on console, which is, absolutely fine, understandable. And they say that PCs intimidate and overcomplicate. PC gaming these days, I think, is easy compared to back then when,
Oh,
you had all these issues. Even making a PC now is just a dollar. You just slot the parts in. Windows does basically everything. But back then, it was an absolute minefield. So,
it
wow.
was.
Well, actually, I had a chat with Dave the other night there. Just give me a call, and Mel, you'll know whenever Dave calls you. It's about an
Yeah.
hour long. It's an hour long phone call that you get. So
Oh yeah.
we're talking away and about kind of various games and stuff, and I was talking about my very first PC, and it was a Cyrix 686 MX 200 megahertz with like 300 megabyte hard drive and like two meg of RAM or something. This was like 1997, and I remember I got it for college. I just left high school. I was going to college, and of course you hear about Quake. So I bought the big box version of Quake, and I had no 3D card in this thing, so I'm running this at like, I don't know, 480 by 240 or something. It's pixelated, but of course I had no space left for college work. So before I turned it off, I'm looking about going, how can I free up space? And I'm going, that folder called Windows, that's a bit big. I'll just delete that. And of course, all these warnings are coming up, right? It's like, this, are you sure? Are you sure? I'm like, I guess, yes. Held the power button and went to bed for the night, got up in the morning to then do college work. And of course, black screen of death, and it was like, .dll is missing. This .dll is missing. And I'm like, So that was my crash course to reinstalling Windows.
Oh,
At the age of like 17, 18, I was like, oops. all because of Quake.
Yeah, damn Quake.
So what inspired the Windows idea then, Mel? Because that's a hardcore way to go about it, about playing those old Sega games. Because I haven't got many. I've got Virtua Fighter, and that's a struggle to get running on a modern PC. It's possible, but it's there's challenges. But what drove you to go the whole hog and get the Windows 98 PC set up?
Well, man, doing Sega Lord X, man, a lot of times I come off like I have experienced everything gaming has to offer because I was so involved in like importing early and things like that. But I mean, nothing could be further from the truth. I actually had very little experience with computers of any kind. no experience with Sega PC games while, the Sega Genesis, the Sega Saturn, and the Dreamcast were on the market. It's like, I mean, I wanted to just kind of expand into another area where I had never experienced much of it before. And Sega PC games are always mentioned in the comments of my videos when I review a game. Someone will bring up, you should review the PC version, or the PC version had this, that, or the other. And, I was never able to add that to my videos because I just didn't have the experience with it. So, of course, like you say, the first thing I tried to do was get these old Sega PC games running on my modern PC, which, let me tell you, I had about enough of that after about 2 days of trying. So, after I had enough of that mess, I was like, you know what? I know how to build PCs. Let me go online and source some old PC parts. And that's when I came to the conclusion, holy hell, man, retro PC shit has gone crazy in price. It's like,
Oh
what?
no.
What in God's name, man? It's like an old Voodoo 2 card is like a couple $100 now. It's like it's the same
Really?
Yeah.
price as it was. Yeah. And I'm like, good Lord, man. But anyhow, after I, looked around, I found a couple of good prices. I got the Windows 98 PC up and going. I started buying old Sega PC games, like the actual retail discs. I didn't care about a collection, so I wasn't trying to buy them like complete in box or anything. But, you get the loose disc, and it's actually not all that expensive. So I've been getting games running, and I've been having some success, once the headaches are figured out. But, very soon, whenever I do these reviews of Saturn games, I'm going to put a comparison in there of what the PC version was like at the time. Because I plan on covering some games that were on PC that were at the time so much better than the Saturn ports. Go back and play something like House of the Dead on the PC, man. It really put the Saturn version to shame.
Hmm.
And I wanted to add that kind of content to my channel. So that was the whole thinking behind that.
That's brilliant. I mean, it's stuff like I said, I've got Virtua Fighter, and I think I've got another one. I can't remember off the top of my head right now, but Virtua Fighter is the one that I go to, and that one has. It's called Virtua Fighter PC. You probably got it yourself, Mel, if you're picking these up. And the crazy thing about that one is it's Virtua Fighter and Virtua Fighter Remix on the same disc, and you can
Right.
you can switch on the fly. And you think, man, why couldn't the Sega Saturn version have done that? Release them both on a single disc for like the US and the UK launch, and that would have been perfect. But,
Let people
Sega
pick
had to
from
be
both
Sega,
versions. Yep.
but it's amazing. It's amazing that you can do that on the fly. The trouble that I had with that one is that it runs at you know, whenever you play it without a bunch of mods and stuff, it just plays way too fast. Um, and I had to download some third-party client in order to kind of restrict the frame rate to 30 frames per second. Otherwise, it would go absolutely nuts on a modern system. It still doesn't feel quite right. Like visually, it's like the Saturn version, but without the glitches. Obviously, the arcade models aren't the arcade models, they're the Saturn models, but it's cleaner. But I found it didn't quite play quite right. I'm not sure if there's many others that have got, they look great, but in terms of playing them, they're not quite there. I'm not sure if you
Right.
found that about in your experience on them.
Yeah, the modern versions, there's always something wrong. Even when you get it running, something is wrong about it. There's always something that you run into that just isn't quite what it should be. And even the ones that I was getting to work on my modern computer, I just decided, I was like, look, not only am I having a headache getting these things running, but even when I get them running, they still have these little issues So, that was the whole thinking, I'll just build an old PC and it'll be so much easier. Wasn't quite as easy as I thought it'd be, but it's working. So, it is what it is.
Yeah, and just like anything game, because yeah, when you were saying you were building a an old PC, I know a few people on Twitter who have built older PCs, but then they share like the screenshot where they're trying to buy like a better Voodoo 2 card, and they share the prices. I'm just like, nowhere is safe from these inflated prices, man. No.
No. I think what happens is that, with PC gaming, who the hell ever would have thought that someone would want to go back and build that old technology
Yeah.
again? So, I think a lot of it ended up in the trash
Oh
can.
yeah.
So eventually when people were like retro PC, I'm gonna like make a Windows 98 PC and play games that way. And so they started being, they were interested in those higher end video cards at that time and those higher end CPUs at that time. And when you go back and you look for them, there's just not that many around anymore. So of course, naturally, the price goes up.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, it's a real pain, man, because a lot of those games back then, it wasn't like it is today where there's really only two real, video
Yeah.
card manufacturers anymore. Back then, man, there were like, a dozen different manufacturers making video cards. So
Yeah.
some games would support some video cards and other games would support the other
Oh
video
God, yeah.
cards. So it winds up being a real pain in the ass having to deal with that.
I know. It's then you see a lot of the people complaining today about there's features in Nvidia that aren't in AMD, and this game supports this DLSS and AMD, but it doesn't support this in Nvidia. They don't know the pain of the 90s PC gamer. But oh, I can't wait to see that, Mel. That's gonna be something.
Yeah.
It's crazy you mentioned PC because that couldn't be, the topic today was going to be Sega's console legacy, and we're touching on Sega's PC legacy. Forget about the arcade for a second, which is a bit. But no, that's brilliant. So yeah, as a topic, we were talking about, Sega's console legacy. Because when we were thinking about, what would be a good discussion point, um, and we chose console because I think Sega's arcade legacy is pretty well defined, isn't it? I mean, Sega started off as an amusement machine division, and still make arcade machines to this day. They're not as prolific as they once were, obviously, but it was only what 6 months ago or so that they re-released Virtua Fighter 3 TB into arcades. And look, so they're still doing that. But then they had this 20-year period where they were making consoles. And it's quite interesting when you think back that their first console was released day and date with the original Famicom. So their console legacy goes as far back as Nintendo's. So I thought it would be interesting to discuss, what exactly is Sega's console legacy? I mean, James and I have talked about Sega's legacy in the past, and that it's often forgotten, often by Sega themselves.
Mhm.
But yeah, I thought it'd be a good chat. What is it? I mean, to start with, is their legacy tied with Nintendo because of that initial clash with the Famicom, and Sega will always seem like they were trying to outdo Nintendo, at least for the majority of their console years. I mean, what would you think about that part of it, Mel?
I don't know. When you really break down just the console legacy, really over time, Sega's almost become just a footnote in Nintendo's legacy.
Mhm.
Yeah.
To a lot of people, it's like a lot of people don't really see Sega as this defining company that, pushed boundaries and made headway with their, various types of software. A lot of times, whenever you hear Sega come up, it's tied to Nintendo's legacy so closely that you really can't have a conversation about it without bringing Nintendo up.
Yeah.
Because back in those days, it really was for the longest time, like you say, pretty much from the Famicom SG-1000 through the 80s into the Super Nintendo, Genesis, or Mega Drive, as you guys call it, you know, on into the Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast. It was just Sega and Nintendo until Sony pops in, and sort of nobody knows what's going to happen with Sony there for a little while before they started kicking everybody's ass. But I don't know, man. You look back on the legacy for a non-Sega fan, and Sega's almost just, they're the company that Nintendo beat. In the 8-bit era, Sega's the company that kind of hung around a little bit in the 16-bit era, but Nintendo still beat them worldwide, and then they're the company that got absolutely smashed, with the Saturn. If you look outside us, the hardcore, fans, I'm not really sure Sega's console legacy even exists or is respected by even the game media of today.
That's a big thing.
Yeah, I mean, take a moment and look at every year when these big gaming websites do like their top 100 lists. Yep. Or they do like their best genre lists, or whatever the hell the best list is for these places. Tell me how many Sega games you find in those lists. IGN did a top 100 the last few years that had not one Sega game in it. Not one, not a single one. You're telling me that you can make a list of 100 of the best games ever and not have a single Sega game? Not a Phantasy Star, not, a Streets of Rage, not a, a Shinobi. I mean, good Lord, man, how many good games did Sega make for 20 years and not a single one is there? And I think that really goes to show you, well, number one, I think a lot of the gaming media today were Nintendo kids when they grew up. But I think it really goes to show you that from a perspective of looking at the industry objectively, it doesn't really happen, does it? No one is looking at the industry in the 80s and half of the 90s at the very least, and can exclude Sega's contributions to this business. I mean, how do you do that? I mean, the only way you can do that is if either you weren't there to experience it, or you were so wrapped up in one of its competitors that, that's all you thought was the best thing that was going. Sega was just the company that made consoles that lost, So,
was it the GQ list as well? Wasn't it? That
the GQ, it was the GQ list that drove our discussion around Sega's legacy, and that, that exactly what you're saying, Mel. That it's forgotten, it's disrespected. There's a lot of recency bias in there, because you look at these top 100s, and most of them are games that have come out in the last 5 or 10 years. The GQ one that we saw, and it wasn't like the IGN one. We actually had 2 Sega games on there, but they were Sonic the Hedgehog, the first one, and Shenmue. The 2 that...
The tokens.
The tokens, yeah.
Yeah.
And could you say that they're the best games in their series? I'd argue Shenmue 2 is better. I'd argue Sonic 2 is better than Sonic 1. And even then, are they the best games on their respective consoles? I don't think you could say that either way. Obviously, it's accounted for personal taste, but they do feel like just the tick box. We've got to have a Sonic game on there. We've got to have a Dreamcast game on there, and that's it. And I think it is that people haven't played these games, and obviously guys like us, we're getting on, we're all in our 40s now. You can't expect everyone, there's been generations and generations of gamers beyond us, and you can't expect them and the journalists to have played everything. But you do think, if you're going to make a list like that and say that it's, these are the greatest games of all time, go back and play these games, go back and experience them. There's many ways for people to experience them. There's, as terrible as Sega are at keeping their, respecting their old franchises and bringing them onto modern platforms for gamers to play. There are there are games that people can play on them. So it is frustrating to see that really.
Yeah.
I
Because
just
what was
wish.
it as well? The GQ, I'm sure that actual article, it referenced Sega as the Sonic the Hedgehog publisher. I'm like,
Yes.
really?
Yeah.
That's what you're reducing them to? A publisher? Like, no, they created the damn thing and they created a hell of a lot more. I mean, see what you said there about like Shenmue being like a footnote. It's like kind of tangent, but see, I love Shenmue, right? I mean, still memories of seeing that game. Couldn't understand a word of it whenever I seen the Japanese version, being in total awe of it. But like, see, whenever Yu Suzuki gets mentioned these days, it's only Shenmue that comes up, and that annoys me. Like, they were talking about Sega's legacy, Yu Suzuki's legacy, man. Like, come on, he is more than Shenmue. And again, I'm not shitting on Shenmue. Love that game to death, but he's just got so much more, you know, behind him, backing him up that he's done. Games that obviously I'd rather play Virtua Fighter than Shenmue, but it's like again, these are just like kind of token mentions that they get. As you say, there's Sonic. I will mention that. I think there might have been a Yakuza game. I think we get 3 games in that list. Dan, there was a
Yes,
Yakuza
yes,
game.
Yakuza Zero, which
Yeah,
again is the one everyone goes for.
so you go for a Yakuza, a Sonic, and a Shenmue. It's like never mind. And what you said there, Mel, as well about potentially the gaming media. We're obviously getting on. We do our channels. That's how we get our word out there. But a lot of these game journalists now are getting younger as we're getting older. These guys are coming through, and they've only really got that experience of like maybe like whenever people like we remember Xbox 360 launching. We were in our 20s when the 360 launched, but this is like some kid's version of like the NES or the SNES or the Genesis. It's like so that as Dan said, recency bias is a big thing, but you can't create a list like IGN. IGN not having a single Sega game, I think, is probably more criminal. Like GQ only having 3 is one thing, but for IGN, the mighty IGN, to not have one, like, come on, guys.
Yeah, when I went through that top 100 that they did, I was like, I was going through it. Of course, they start high and they work the list down, to number one. And of course, as I'm getting closer, to like 30, 25, I'm kind of like getting this like feeling. I'm like, are you shitting me? These guys are actually going to put out a list and not have a single Sega game. And then they're going to put NES and Super Nintendo games in it that, I mean, I know I'm biased, but still, there's NES and Super Nintendo games on this list that there are Genesis and Saturn and Dreamcast games that are way better than some of
Yeah.
these games. It's like, are you freaking kidding me here? And stuff like that. If you're going to have the balls to do a top 100 where you're saying these are the 100 best games that have ever hit the market, then the group you're pulling these from needs to be pretty diverse in their experience. I mean, if you're getting this list from a bunch of 20-year-olds and, all they've played, the lowest thing that they've played, as far as generation is stuff from like the PlayStation 1, you probably need to expand a little bit as
Yeah.
to who you're asking the best games are. I bet you there's not a single person in IGN's offices right now that have beaten Phantasy Star 4. I bet you that there's not a single person in the IGN office that can even tell you what the story is about in Phantasy Star 4. And if that's the case, you need to broaden your the list of people that you're including in this, because that list isn't really all valid. You should just call it IGN's favorite 100
Yeah.
games.
Or IGN's favorite games from the last 20 years featuring some Nintendo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there, and that is a bit of a frustration because there are ways to play these Sega console games. There's a lot of fanfare when Sega Genesis titles get added to the Nintendo Switch Online. Um, so, as I say, as bad as Sega are, for a lot of these people, there's still no excuse to not play a lot of these games with a lot of like modern conveniences. I can't remember if Fantasy Star 4 or is on the Switch Online list, but it was in the recent collection that came out to Switch, Xbox One, and PS4. So there really is no excuse. But part of it is, how do you get people to engage in that? And I think that's something that we try to do as creators, is try to bang that drama about, you know, you should play these games because these are the memories that we have. This was the company that we grew up with. You get people that these days, people console war on social media. They plant their flag, whether they're Xbox or PlayStation or Nintendo. Well, we planted our flag firmly on the Sega side, and while people like to imagine that it was, full of pain and the Sega's consoles failed, to be honest, we just loved it. The only pain was really when the new releases kind of dried up on the Sega Saturn between that and the Dreamcast. But aside from that, there's not a single moment of regret whenever or pain or anything. We played the occasional bad games, but yeah, there's not a single moment really that I regret, and I can't imagine either of you to regret in our choice and where we wanted to plant our flag and the platform that we wanted to dedicate our time to.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of, it's one of those things where it's kind of sad when you think about it, because really when you get down to the nitty gritty of it, we're all that's left of Sega's legacy, the
Yeah.
gamers.
Yeah.
Because you really do have to understand that when Sega was bought by Sammy, back in the early 2000s, Sega as we knew it ceased to exist.
Yeah. Yeah.
The company that we knew that made consoles, that made those arcade games, that gave us so much joy when we were younger, that company basically was broken up. The people that made those games moved on, or most of them moved on, and the company that became of that was kind of a lot of people just want to call it what it's titled. It's a holdings company. Basically,
Yep.
they just have Sega's namesake. They've got Sega's IP rights. That's what they bought. They bought Sega's IPs, Sega's name, and this is the Sega that exists now. And every game that they put out, you can kind of feel that in their software, because I'm not saying every game is bad. I would never say that, but every modern Sega game feels different than what Sega games used to feel like. Like when you go back and you play anything, it I'm not saying the magic is completely gone, but it feels different. It's different.
Yeah.
And when it comes right down to it, that pretty much just means guys like us, the people that were there, the people that experienced it, the people that are buying these old consoles today, whether they're younger or older, they're the only ones left of Sega's legacy, because Sega itself doesn't seem too interested in talking about its legacy. So really the only people that are out there pimping that legacy, propping that legacy up, saying, hey, Sega's not just a footnote in Nintendo's history. Sega was really, to millions of people, this great thing that made these incredible games. And guys, we're getting old. We're not going to be around forever. And that's the sad part of it.
Yep.
You think it's bad now. Where's it going to be in 30 or 40 years? Pretty much Sega's just going to be a footnote in books. the console war books. It's like, oh, Sega was this back then, but nobody's gonna remember the games.
Mhm.
And that's the terrible part of it right there. You realize that as we get further away from Sega's console history, the more that history comes muddled, it becomes less impactful. It I don't know, man. It's kind of depressed. I'm depressing myself right now.
I mean, see the thing as well. You're talking about like Sammy and the holding company and all that, and the new Sega games feel different. And you're right. In like, in one hand, it was amazing to see the kind of passion and the kind of outpouring of sheer joy whenever Sega announced the new era, new energy stuff. But at the same time, while we're all out there going, yeah, Crazy Taxi, Jet Set Radio, Shinobi. I mean, the fact that you'd mentioned that you'd love to have seen a Shinobi in the Okami style, and then weeks later, that's exactly what they kind of showed. I thought was quite. I'm like, see, they listen to Mel. That's that. Just, but it's like at the same time, you're like, how are they going to be able to recapture that magic? Like Crazy Taxi, especially, I think not even Sega's own two sequels for Crazy Taxi could match the magic of the first game. I think the first game is just nailed on. It just captures the vibe of the era, the colours, the soundtrack, the brands, everything about it is just spot on. Both sequels were like Crazy Taxi 2, I can't stand. Like the I really I can't go on with it. I've tried so many times back then and today, and I just can't like I know the map for Crazy Taxi 1 inside out. Like you know yourself, the idea is you've got to do laps in Crazy Taxi, right? So if you get to the bus terminal and the guy in the brown suit with the shades is there, if he takes you to the fire station, you look across as a guy in a suit with a bunch of roses. You go across to him 9 times out of 10, he's going to go to the university, and that's you back at the very start again. So you know who to pick up and how to navigate your way around. Crazy Taxi 2, man, that was just like you're driving along and then like the arrow's going that way, but it's a wall. So you then do the crazy hop and you jump over the wall, but then the arrow points back the way. And I'm like, where do you want me to go? It's like, I don't know. It's like, so that in itself, Sega, as it got towards the end of the kind of Dreamcast era and even into the Xbox, the OG Xbox era, there was great games like even Jet Set Radio Future. It dumbed down the Dreamcast version of Jet Set Radio. So that the kind of worry is like these games, they're literally, they've got the name, they've got the look, but are they going to feel as good? And maybe to people like us, they never will. Is it just because again we've got that we're too invested in what we experienced back then? But yeah, it just would be nice to see Sega do a bit more, as you say, to honor their own legacy. Like even like the Saturn especially feels like they bring out like new cushions or new mobile phone charging stations or something like, or water bottles, anything. It's like you get the Mega Drive / Genesis and you get the Dreamcast. And like, what was it that came out recently? They did something, and I remember Dave was like, "Oh, there we go. Saturn's been left out again." It was like there was a Genesis one and a Dreamcast one. I think it was new charging stations or something. I was like, "All right, Saturn's left out again. Are they ashamed of it? Like, why don't you just acknowledge it?" So, but yeah, as you say, it's like we're getting on. All we can do is hope that, and we've said that as well, as we're talking about Sega's legacy, but this content that we're creating is kind of like our legacy. We're whenever we're old and grey, well, some already start to go massively grey, but people, I hope, will come to what we leave out there in the years and decades to come, as long as YouTube leave it. And maybe people coming in can look back and go, wow, look how much these guys loved that company. Like, what did they do so well that these guys put themselves in front of a camera, researched these games, relived their youth, so that we could try and experience it? Hopefully that's the legacy we can leave behind.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think you do see that, that whole Sega Sammy period. I think you do, and I think you mentioned it in your outrun too, video, Mel. I think because I mentioned it at the end of the Outrun video that we did for our channel, and that you can almost see a cut. Outrun 2 feels like the last hurrah of old Sega,
Mm.
and then after that, you're kind of in the Sega Sammy territory where things felt different. You never know. Maybe these new era games will be, they may be okay. I hear that Crazy Taxi may be a live service game, which
Oh, good Lord, man.
apparently it's going to be like a massively online, like 100 taxis going around the city or something like that. That was the rumor, which isn't what Crazy Taxi was all about. But and then bringing it back to what we were talking about just now, it's crazy that a game like Crazy Taxi isn't, mentioned in the 100 greatest games of all time. But when we're talking about console legacy, Crazy Taxi it was innovative, it had the whole, I know you're raging about the arrow just now, James, but the arrow was so important that Electronic Arts decided to take it and put it into the Simpsons Road Rage game. Was it Road Rage or was it the other, whatever their Crazy Taxi clone was? And
Right.
Sega sued them for it because they took they infringed on their trademarked innovation. Um, but I suppose, is Sega's console legacy, is that rooted in bringing the arcade home? Was that the initial objective? Because we know they brought out the SG-1000 because at the time arcades were, weathering the storm a little bit. They weren't as profitable as they once were. Was it always to bring the arcade home? I think that was their promise, wasn't it, from day one? I think even if you look at kind of, I was looking at Superscalers on the Master System in a recent video, and even in those, the Japanese adverts for the Mark III were all about bringing the arcade home, and I think that probably was the dream, wasn't it, Mel? I know that's something you've mentioned on your channel for quite a few times.
Oh yeah, if you go back and you look at Sega initially, I mean, isn't that the reason why any of us wanted a Master System or, a Mega Drive or I mean, go back and look at the ads when those consoles were, being, you know, uh uh, you know, on TV and in magazines. That's all you saw was arcade translation, best place for arcade game. I mean, it was in your face pretty much constantly. And I mean, you really can't blame them at the time because, the arcade really it was like the standard bearer. It's where you wanted your games to be. You wanted your games to look, sound, and play like the arcade because that's what everybody thought was the best at the time. And, throughout the 80s and the early 90s, that was definitely the case, So I think, yeah, I mean, Sega's, kind of there's an overlap there, isn't there? There's like a Sega arcade legacy that kind of overlaps that console legacy where it's like you wanted those Sega games that were arcade games first, but you wanted the Sega version at home so
Yeah.
you could play that. So yeah, they're definitely tied. They're tied together. You want that. You are, at least from my perspective, that's what it was all about for me with the Sega Genesis. The Sega Genesis came out and they were advertising it arcade, 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 and of course, those magazine ads, those commercials, they would even be ballsy enough to put them side by side and show them to you like Golden Axe. This is what the two of them look like. Altered Beast. This is what the two of them look like. And you were sitting there, as a kid, when the Genesis came out, I'm 14 years old and I'm like, holy shit. Look at that. You know, that's like arcade perfect. And of course, it wasn't arcade perfect, but you didn't care. I mean, you were 14. It was close enough.
You've seen it on an ad on a little CRT, and that you don't have 1080p 4K monitors. You've got two tiny little visuals.
Yeah.
You're not going to see the difference between the scaling effects when enemies die in Altered Beast. They're going to look absolutely identical, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh man, that's the thing that our adverts over here as well. And that's the thing that with the Mega Drive or Genesis pack in the States was like, obviously Altered Beast was like kind of like bundled in, and like Tom Kalinske took that out to put Sonic in. But like our ads over here, like Sega Europe really made the Mega Drive so cool over here. It was like you had the Pirate TV, the Pirate, I had the Pirate TV with the big trailer that was it Cybernetic Gamer had
Yeah.
with his bionic arm, Cyber Razor cut, and all that kind of stuff. So they made it really cool. But even at that, they kind of mashed in the footage. So you had like Sonic, you had obviously your arcade games, Streets of Rage was in there. So they kind of mashed everything together. I mean, obviously, my story is well known that I didn't, manage to get a Mega Drive until much later on. I was stuck on the home computers. My Sega legacy in the home began with the Atari ST Power Pack, which was like US gold ports of like Outrun, and the Super Hang On port wasn't bad on the ST, but man, that Outrun port sucked big time. That was so bad. But yeah, that thing about the arcade in the home, that's has always been the kind of the Sega mantra. That's what they always wanted to do, to try and basically bring a slightly cheaper way to experience those games at home. And I know people will always bang the drum about how Dreamcast finally brought the arcade home. And in one context, I agree with it, because it was whenever we got parity with the arcade, primarily due to Naomi, mirroring, Dreamcast hardware, a bit more VRAM. But for me, and this is going to sound like pure bias, but it was like the Saturn was, for me, the console that truly did bring the arcade home. I know the Mega Drive ports of like your Alter Beast and things like that, they were obviously stripped back down, but they were still really playable. Same thing goes for the Saturn arcade games. Like, I don't know, Mel, I'll tell that story just because you'll have listeners probably from your child that might come over. But whenever I got surprised with the Saturn in launch 95, I went to my uncle's house, used to visit every weekend. And I went up there and he stopped me off at the door to his home cinema room. And he used to take me to the arcade every weekend. I would play Virtua Fighter. Could never get past Jeffrey. Like, it took me months to get past Jeffrey. He used to kick my ass all the time. So up to his, and he kind of stopped me at the door of his home cinema room. And all I could hear was a crescendo of like the character select music and the dilling, dilling, all the wee jingles. I'm like, what's going on? And he's standing there with something behind his back. And he's going, wait, wait. Of course, all I hear is a fight, one, ready, go. And my face dropped. I'm like, holy fuck, he's got Virtua Fighter in there. Like, so he had it hooked up to like a 50-inch rear projection TV through his surround sound system. Mel, I'm telling you, when he opened that door, that was Virtua Fighter from the arcade that I was seeing. It was on a big ass screen. The sound was booming. Like, and it wasn't until like later on, when you kind of read magazines and you kind of see people bringing it up as the years go on, that the polygons glitched. I didn't see anything glitching whenever I seen that. I was like in total awe of this, that this was in the house. How could this behemoth of an arcade machine? Because like the arcade I went to had the big deluxe, like the giant screen with the big long control panel with the bench that you sat on. It was a deluxe cab. How the hell was that game now in my uncle's house? Like, how was that possible? So, like, for me, that was like the Saturn is what really, for me, brought, that was Sega bringing the arcade home. You played Virtua Cop 1 with the stunner or the Virtua gun. You played that on a rear projection TV. That was the arcade. You're playing Sega Rally. Okay, nowadays you look at it, the arcade version's a lot sharper, draw distance is a lot better. But again, how the hell is this running in your house? These were like the most cutting edge arcade games, and you were getting to experience these in your home. And I think the Dreamcast gets a lot of credit for bringing parity, but I don't think the Saturn's Legacy gets enough praise for actually trying to be so damn ambitious for the level of hardware, the complexity of the hardware, that what it tried to bring in. These Model 2 games, it had no right to run these as well as it did. So
yeah.
That's just me.
Even Model 1, though.
Saturn love.
Even Model 1, though. I mean, it's like you said on the editor's corner, Mel, getting Virtua Fighter as a launch game on the Sega Saturn just 1 year after the 1993 release was a huge deal.
Yeah.
And when you think back about some of the reception, the retrospectives now, when people look at it and say it was a poor port, etc., it was glitching and all this sort of stuff, you go back and you think, not 3 years earlier was Final Fight coming to the Super Nintendo, heavily compromised. And that was a game that was 1 or 2 years old at that point. And now, just 3 years later, you're getting a cutting edge 3D game on the Sega Saturn in its launch window. And I don't think that that's kind of appreciated enough for what that done, and that was how expectations had changed that much. That all of a sudden, you know, this amazing feat to bring one of the most advanced arcade games to a home console in such a short space of time is all of a sudden scoffed at. And I know we've looked at it in the past, and like the reviews of the Japanese version of the time are very complimentary. But it's just crazy when you think back at the way that stuff looks back on now with these much harsher eyes without realizing like the actual context that Virtua Fighter came out to.
Yeah. I think a lot of it too is timing, isn't it? Because you go back and you look at like situations like that, and Virtua Fighter comes out on the Saturn in Japan in November of 94. And then it's literally what, a month later, month and a half later, you start to see these big PlayStation games coming out. So the impact that normally, you know, a person would pay attention to, like, wow, we have Virtua Fighter only a year after the arcade, and it looks like this. All of a sudden, it wasn't as appreciated as much because people were right on to Toshinden and Ridge Racer, and they were like instantly like, whoa, look at these games. And kind of the shitty thing about that is that in order to do that, you almost had to completely discount gameplay, didn't you?
Yeah.
Because I don't think anybody that really appreciates gameplay in a racer or a fighter is going to sit and tell you that Ridge Racer or Toshinden played as well as Daytona or Virtua Fighter. I guess it does come down to quite a bit of preference there, but when it comes really to it, people were basically just graphic whores, man. They
Yeah.
were like, they were just like, oh, Toshinden is textured map, Virtua Fighter's not. Oh, Ridge Racer, has farther draw, distances and a smoother frame rate. So these games were instantly better.
Yeah.
And, that impact that those games would have had otherwise, like having that Daytona USA game on your Saturn in your home. I can't remember when it came out in Japan exactly, but it was very shortly before the US launch. So there wasn't a lot of time in between the Japanese version and the US version, but it didn't matter. And because you weren't going to get the appreciation that, hey, this really great looking arcade game has come home really playable, it was just all eyes were instantly on Ridge Racer.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of those things that kind of hurt Sega the entire run of its releases. It always seemed to have the worst timing of certain things. It was the same way with the Dreamcast too. The Dreamcast comes out early, it's being compared to PlayStation games initially, and everyone's like, wow, the Dreamcast is so cool. So the Dreamcast gets that bit of extra oomph. But then all of a sudden, the PlayStation 2 bullshit started, that it was this supercomputer that could render 22 billion polygons, and it could do it could do the scene from Final Fantasy VIII in real time. And then everybody was like, oh, Dreamcast sucks. We got to get a PlayStation 2.
I mean, it was bullshit though.
Oh, it was such bullshit.
I mean, see, just to very quickly go back to that Daytona point. I mean, Mel, I don't know if you've seen the video that I done for our channel. It was called Daytona USA. You've been lied to, right?
Yeah, I watched it a few days ago.
Yeah, and it's been quite good to see. Also, a couple of kind of idiotic comments as you expect. Like someone tried to correct me, say, "Well, excuse me, Ridge Racer on PS1 runs at 60 FPS," and I'm like, "No, mate, it really doesn't." It's like there was a high tech demo with one track and one car that did run it at 60 FPS, but that was it. But it's been refreshing to see like so many people actually in the comments, like actually thanking me for making the video. Someone even said recently, you have to go on and correct the wiki page because the lies that you've just debunked are still on there. I'm like, it's like, so it was, gameplay Daytona wise was just phenomenal. You know, it just nails it. How at that low frame rate that it still just captures the feel of the arcade. It's just, I know, of all of us here are massive fans of that game, but yeah, it was just, again, Ridge Racer just had that kind of hype behind it because, the draw distance and the soundtrack that people seem to like, but Rotterdam Nation for me is like literally the audio version of a migraine. Like it's like that soundtrack just irks me. But yeah, it was pleasant to see so many people actually resonating with that video and saying, oh, it's good that someone's actually said that, because that narrative again has gone on that, that this port was trashed at the time, that no one liked it, that everyone said it played bad. And, I'm like, I went back and looked at all the reviews, and there was a couple of, it was a French gaming magazine gave it like 72%, which was one of the lowest, but all the mags were giving it, not just the Sega affiliated ones, but they were all giving it respectable scores. Is like Digitizer, as I mentioned in the video, one of the harshest critics of the Saturn and Sega in general. Dan, I mean, I think they gave Sonic 3 like 3 out of 5 or something,
Yeah,
wasn't
60
it?
for 60%.
Yeah, so they were notorious, and people were going, "Well, it's a gaming magazine on teletext. How much clout can it have?" But like Mr. Blogo is pretty respected in the UK scene.
Mr. Biffo.
Mr. Biffo, sorry, Blogo. That's
Don't
Blogo.
confuse. Yeah,
Oh,
Blogo is a good guy.
Blogo's
Biffo.
our pal, Mr. Biffo. He's a respected kind of like games reviewer, and he had a real beanie's bonnet about Sega, and for him to even review it and praise the fact that, yeah, it's not the same as this multi-thousand-pounds cabinet, but it plays so damn well. So I just wanted to kind of put that narrative out there, and hopefully, as it has done, that people kind of resonate with it. But I didn't want to kind of cut off too far from your PlayStation 2 point, because oh man, the bullshit you mentioned, talking about like maybe Nintendo, shitting on Sega's legacy and maybe including them as part of a footnote. That PS2 stuff was crazy. Like, it could do Toy Story visuals in real time. Have you seen the Phantom Menace? It can do the pod racing scene in real time. It's like,
Yeah.
and then I got mine home because I pre-ordered one. I think mine came through 2 weeks after launch, and like, oh man, like I felt as if my Japanese Dreamcast that I'd had for like a year plus at that point was just laughing at me. Like, I put Ridge Racer 5 on, and I know John Linneman's a massive fan of Ridge Racer 5, but I don't know why Jaggies in the kind of modern day, I see this more and more on X, like people see Jaggies as sharpness. It's like Jaggies are being accepted as like, oh, it's super sharp. Like, I remember putting on like Ridge Racer 5 and being like, I've just been conned. Like, what is this? Like, there was just no smoothness. It ran rapid, don't get me wrong, but it was all greys and light tones of blue. The red on the car was just so dull. There was like, just didn't pop. And that's what those Sega games did. They popped when you played them. And Ridge Racer 5 certainly didn't have that at all.
No, it was very dull. It was very dull. But just to come back, to bring those 2 points together, because I was just thinking, it's about timing, like you say, Mel. It's almost like Sega just had the most unfortunate timing, even back to the very beginning of their console journey. They've got this SG-1000, which Sega at the time considered a success in Japan, as they sold way more than they expected. But it comes out the exact same day as the Famicom, which would become the NES. If you wanted to launch alongside any console in history, it's not that one. Is it?
No.
And then and as you say, it's been timing all the way through. I mean, the Mega Drive for Genesis had pretty good timing. That came out pretty early. And that managed to get a foothold in the market before the Super Nintendo launched in the US and Europe. But then you look at the way that the 32X launched, the timing with that and the Sega Saturn so close together, well, they were a week apart. The Saturn launch in Japan and the 32X launch in the US was a week apart. And then the Dreamcast. And I think coming back to bring that together is that, yeah, the Dreamcast did realize that dream in bringing the arcade home. You know, the timing of that meant that games like Soul Calibur weren't just arcade perfect; they were better than arcade perfect. But and then you had your Naomi games, your Crazy Taxis, that were all arcade perfect. But then that coincides with the death of the arcade. You know, that whole genre at that point is the appeal is strongly diminished. People don't want the arcade games anymore. They want that, they want their Gran Turismos, they want Final Fantasy games, they want games that they can spend hours and hours and hours in. Not so much these arcade games anymore. And it's the timing there, which I think that kind of was, it's fitting almost that Sega set out to bring the arcade home. And when they finally achieved that, that was kind of when they bowed out the industry. I don't know, is that just me? There's something poetic there almost, isn't there?
Yeah, it's actually funny when you put it like that. It's almost like Sega had a big meeting after the Dreamcast was launched, and they were just like, "Okay, we did it. Close the fucking thing down. We're done. You know, let's go get some pizza. Call it a day."
Uh, we've been working on this for 30 years. We've finally done it. That's it, guys. It's been a pleasure. Handshakes
Yeah,
all
Yeah.
round.
yeah.
That's it. Oh,
Oh
man.
man, that's terrible. That's terrible.
Aye,
But
it's almost like Sega almost like kind of, well, we know Sega essentially killed themselves, but whenever you put it like that, mate, it actually does kind of tie in quite well. It's like they achieved the end goal, and then like people went, oh well, don't have to go to the arcade anymore. We can just sit in the house and do it. So, oh
yeah,
Yeah.
man,
they completed console gaming and that was it.
I completed it, mate. That's it.
But
Oh,
I mean, yeah, so beyond bringing the arcade home, there's so much more to Sega's console legacy. And it's a shame, like when we were talking earlier, people do think it's like you were saying, James. I think that Sega are the Sonic publisher, but Sega had Sega had an entire console generation before Sonic. Um, People remember Sega for the Mega Drive and Genesis, and sometimes it's like modern Sega could do with remembering themselves that there are consoles beyond the Mega Drive and Genesis. I know in like a Dragon Gaiden, we at least got a Japanese Master System that you could play a few games on. But yeah, they were for a period defined by that, especially during that era in the early 90s. They were Sega was synonymous with Sonic, but there's so much more to them than that. I don't know if the fact that they changed what were their key franchises every single generation kind of impacts that. As you look at Nintendo is Mario, Metroid, um, and God, what I've got for
Zelda.
some Zelda, yeah. Um, you know, Xbox is Halo, Gears, Forza, PlayStation a little bit more loose, but that's God of War, Ratchet and Clank, and all that sort of stuff. But Sega, on the Master System, it was Fantasy Zone, Hang On, and Shinobi. But then for the Mega Drive, your Sonic Streets of Rage, and then you move to the Sega Saturn. It's different again. It's Virtua Fighter and Daytona, and then did you like those games where you can have a new Virtua Fighter? We won't bring Daytona 2 over, but we'll give you all these new franchises. And I don't think, on one hand, I think that's great because Sega were always keeping it fresh and interesting. But by the same token, I think that kind of hurts their legacy to kind of, more casual game players and Sega fans because they're like, well, this franchise that I really liked from the system isn't here. So I'm going to see what else is out there.
Yeah, when I actually did one video about why the Sega Saturn failed, because I've always felt my opinion was so different than what you normally heard when people talked about it. And I I don't think I did the video right. A lot of people took away things from it that I never meant them to take away. But I was basically saying why the Sega Saturn failed was because all of its games were completely different than what you had seen on the Genesis and Mega Drive.
Mhm.
The fact of the matter is that we can talk about it being launched early. We can talk about pissing retailers off. We can talk about the price of the unit being too high. We can talk about the stiff competition it was getting from Sony. I don't think any of that would have mattered if Sega had had the right games available. And it's not that necessarily the games that they had were wrong, it's what it was missing that was the problem.
Yeah.
You know, having Virtua Fighter was good. Having Daytona USA was good. Having something like early on, even having something like the platformers that they had, like Clockwork Knight and stuff like that, that was good. But they were missing so much. There was no Sonic in those early days. That had been the thing that had driven sales. They had nothing. They didn't have a Streets of Rage. They didn't have an Echo the Dolphin. They didn't have a Kid Chameleon. They didn't have, for the love of God, man, they didn't have anything hardly from the Genesis.
Yeah.
And when something did come over, it was so incredibly different. Like when Golden Axe The Duel was the Golden Axe game they tried to sell people. It wasn't what people were expecting. It wasn't what got people excited. I think what would have happened is if they had had a Sonic and a Streets of Rage ready close to launch, at launch, around launch, what it would have done is people would have been like, oh man, the Sega I loved, that's where they are. I want that Sonic. I want that, Streets of Rage. But then on top of that, they would have been like, wow, look at this Virtua Fighter. Look at this Panzer Dragoon. And it would have been like, oh, it would have been like everything would have coalesced into just this perfect launch of having something for everybody. And Sega didn't have that. Sega didn't have that. And you're absolutely right. It decimates their legacy because take a Master System fan. A lot of those Master System fans weren't Mega Drive fans. Take the Mega Drive. A lot of those Mega Drive fans weren't Saturn fans. So on and so forth, because every generation, Sega almost hit the reset button.
Yep.
They were like, we're going to go in this direction with this software, and that's just all there is to it. And I mean, like you say, in one way, it yielded this large treasure trove of new software, which is never anything wrong with that. But can you imagine, would Nintendo still be here at the level they're at if they had done the same thing?
Yeah.
They've fostered generation after generation of fans who have essentially grew up with these franchises. No matter what system they buy, they're a constant in their lives as they get older, and it resonates. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, and another thing that happens when you release generation to generation, you're iterating. You are taking a game that you have already made and you're asking yourself, how can we make this better? How can we add to this game to make it better than what it was on the previous generation? Your games grow in technical prowess, they grow in design, they grow in art. It's how Nintendo has remained so relevant, because every time they make a Mario, and man, they've made a lot of Marios. Every time they make a Zelda, and they've made a lot of Zeldas, those games largely feel different from one another in mechanics in some way, in art style in some way. Sega really didn't do that, did they? Or they didn't do it enough. And I think you're right. That does impact legacy to a degree, because not only is Sega's legacy trying to be, salvaged by the older gamers like us, but we're segmented. We're segmented in what we enjoy because of the way Sega released its games.
Yeah,
what
absolutely.
you said as well, Mill, about bringing across those kind of key franchises. I think a lot of the obviously why Sega paid so much attention to the media and voices around the kind of the 3D and 2D. Like, it's great to see 2D is appreciated going back the way, like, people love pixel art now. But at the time, the media, despite having no experience of 3D, became experts on what should make a good 3D game, and they kind of dictated that, and Sega sort of responded to that, like Fighting Force getting dropped. Core brought that over and says, do you want to have that in Streets of Rage 4? No, but then again, that was moving into 3D again. How amazing would it have been if Sega had just stuck to their guns and, as you said, released a Saturn with a Virtua Fighter, with a Daytona, with a Panzer Dragoon, but a proper Streets of Rage 4, a proper Sonic 4, just even dipping into the super scalar stuff, Outrunners, a proper, not the Mega Drive or Genesis port, which is really, really poor in comparison, but, just bring those super scalar games across. Like, that system was so well set up. You look at examples of games that, like, look at Stellar Assault SS, not Stellar Assault, Night Striker SS. Like, that's an amazing, amazing scalar game. I love that. It's a phenomenal port. The Mega CD version was good, but the Saturn port is just nailed on. And why they kind of just decided to completely ignore, again, ignoring their own legacy and just go in a completely different path. Like, they could have released a kind of a mashup, almost a perfect storm of 2D and 3D, and then just went, right, so for people that are new and excited by 3D, this is what we've got for you. From the people who had the Mega Drive Genesis, we've got you guys covered too, and just went into one package. But, this whole move to 3D just seemed to spook them big time.
Yeah, it's a shame we got Golden Axe the Duel, excuse me, instead of Revenge of Death Adder.
Oh,
because
mate, where is that game?
it feels like that would have been a no-brainer, because then the DNA of the 16-bit era is then directly carried over. Yeah, they've got a new cast of characters. It's not, it's not the same game, but you can still see the dotted line between the franchises. Whereas Golden Axe the Duel not only was new characters, I think Gilius is in there as a playable character, and obviously you've got Death Adder. But beyond that, it's completely new, and it's more Samurai Showdown than Golden Axe. Golden Axe, Revenge of Death Adder would have been brilliant. And yeah, you would have had people like the people that reviewed some of the games back then, because they were 2D. It was according to them, it was old hat. But you still would have had, even casual gamers who didn't even look in the media and stuff. They see a brand new Golden Axe game on the Saturn and the identity's there. And I think sometimes I don't think it's necessarily the game necessarily had to be, from a purely commercial standpoint, it didn't have to be perfect. I think one of Sega's biggest mistakes of that era, then there were many, maybe not the biggest, but one mistake was not letting the team behind Bug use the Sonic IP, because apparently that's what Bug was meant to be, and Ho Nakayama vetoed it. But if you swap the Bug sprite for a Sonic sprite, it's halfway there. And Bug was well regarded on release, and still, it's tough, but it's still quite playable now. But you would have had that franchise on there in a 3D game, not truly 3D, but a game that embraced 3D to an extent, and I think that would have brought people in. But Sega were always keen to just hit that reset button, as you say, Mel, weren't they?
Yeah, it's actually, think about this for a second. There were 2.5D games on the Saturn in its first year. Think about how many of those games could have easily been turned into a Sonic.
Yeah.
I mean, Clockwork Knight could have been Sonic in Toyland. Bug could have been at Sonic at the movies. I mean, Sega could have done anything to really bring the games that it needed forward. And what really boggles my mind is that if you go back and you look at the specifications of the Saturn pretty much could draw the screen full of sprites.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it really had no limit as to how many sprites it could draw on the screen at one time. It's the reason why when you go and you look at a game like Dragon Force,
Yep.
you have essentially 200 and some sprites when you count the special effects and the generals. They're going across the battlefield just as smooth as can be. What other consoles could have done that game at that time? That shows you that 2D power, where even if it had been 2D, it would have been 2D you had never seen before.
Yep.
Can you imagine if they had developed a new Golden Axe, a Golden Axe 4, and it had been 2.5D, and as you're running out into the start, you find your friend dead. Your friend is like, we're losing the battle. We're losing the battle. And then your sprite runs forward and like 100 enemies are just bearing down on you. Had you seen anything like that before? The
Nope.
Saturn would have been the only console that would have been capable of giving you something like that. Because all the other machines that were released at the time, you were reaching their fill rates when they were putting sprites on the screen, which means at a certain point, they were going to start to slow down. The Saturn really didn't have this problem. Not to mention the Saturn had a special background chip in it that could draw infinite planes. You could have created all kinds of cool 3D effects in 2D scrolling games just with those infinite planes popping off in the background. I mean, Sega had the idea because you see it in Clockwork Knight. You see the 2.5D elements in Clockwork Knight. You see those infinite planes playing out in Bug, where the infinite planes are the sky and ultimately the main ground, and then you've got the polygon world that you're actually running across. Man, Sega had the wherewithal to understand how to make these games work with the Saturn. Where the hell were the games at? You know, why weren't they trying anything? I mean, when at the end of Sonic, one of the coolest things on the Mega Drive, when I first played Sonic, I got to the end of the stage. There's the little Robotnik thing that's like got the little animals prisoner.
Yeah.
And you jump onto that thing and like 20, 30 animals pop out of it. And I'm like, wow, the Mega Drive is so powerful. Look at all that color and sprite and sprites on the screen. Man, can you imagine what the Saturn would have been able to pop out of that? I mean, I'm just saying, you think about these simple things when people say 2D wasn't good enough, 2D wasn't popular anymore. They're referring to 2D as it was in the 16-bit era, but the Saturn's 2D was so much more capable than that. The Saturn at its heart was way more powerful than even something like the Neo Geo. A lot of people will look back and they will say, oh, but these Neo Geo ports that the Saturn got were compromised in small ways. Man, they were compromised because they were originally ROM cartridges. They were not compromised because the Saturn wasn't powerful enough. The Saturn could display many times the sprites that the Neo Geo could do. The level of 2D that we could have got on the Saturn, had it been explored to its absolute fullest, would have been way more than any 2D you ever would have encountered on the PlayStation Nintendo 64. And I think that begs, in any argument, you really have to put that out there. Had Sega doubled down, the 2D that we would have got if that console had been 3-4 years worth of 2D games, it would have been 2D like you had never seen before.
Mm-hmm.
Really need to see this Golden Axe game now. I've got in my head that it's like Koei's Warriors games where you go on a field with hundreds of enemies. Just imagine Gilius with his axe swinging it against 100 enemies. Oh man, that would have been so cool.
All I had in my head there was the scene for Game of Thrones when you see behind Jon Snow with the army coming, he's like, the sword coming. It's like the 2D Golden Axe version of that, man. That would have been epic. Aye. Oh.
Yep.
I do know we lament, the fact that the Saturn's legacy, particularly in the West, is diminished because of some of these decisions. The fact that Sega didn't take advantage of the hardware. But I think the Saturn still has a legacy that needs to be respected, especially
Oh,
in Japan, where they got, I think they did a poll, didn't they, to um, to people that bought the Mega Drive Mini 2 and asked what mini console they
right.
wanted to see, and everyone voted. The winner was the Sega Saturn. Um, and I think, and again, that's kind of when you talk about the arc, we talked about the arc of Sega bringing the arcade home. The Saturn was Sega's arc of finally defeating Nintendo in Japan,
Mhm.
albeit very slightly and only in Japan. But it is still a console that's very well remembered there. And you've got stuff like, where an anime, Uncle from Another World, does a better job
So good.
reflecting the Sega Saturn's legacy than I think anyone in the modern games media or Sega themselves does. But I think
Absolutely.
it's still, the way that they talk about the top 100 games and they talk about specific titles and his favorite games, Guardian Heroes, and it's wonderful stuff. Well, I think that's still a legacy that's definitely it's worth remembering. And I think it's part of that that needs to be that one Sega need to push out more and get into people's minds, especially with on the back of something like that. But also something that I wish that modern gamers could experience a lot more.
Yeah. That's probably one thing that we should say, one thing we should keep in mind about doing content like this is we are talking about the way that it exists versus the way it should be. Everything I've pretty much said, I'm giving it from a perspective of how it really is in reality. But the way it should be is every Sega console has put games out that has been a huge part of gaming for millions of people. And that legacy deserves respect. It deserves being carried on. We can talk about how it really is, but it's probably just equally as important to talk about how it should be. These games, man, some of them are so well made. It really is. You can play these games still today, and there's no modern analog to it.
Mhm.
I mean, again, I'll bring it up again. Dragon Force. Find me a game that is just like that on a modern system.
Nothing.
Oh, you've got bits and pieces of it in games here and there, but really, there's nothing like Dragon Force. And back then, you could only play that on a Saturn. Find me something like Knights. Could only play Knights on the Saturn. You can pick out these Sega games that were made and they felt so right, so different. They stood on their own as like pillars of design perfection almost. And that's what makes it so sad that the Sega Legacy isn't more respected, because how can anybody with an objective eye look back at some of that stuff and go, that stuff isn't important to talk about anymore?
Yeah,
That game, you know, doesn't stand up to these other games from that same era. It's like I'm a big Resident Evil fan, huge Resident Evil fan, love Resident Evil. How many people talk about Deep Fear?
yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, those games were actually not terribly far apart in terms of release. We're talking, single digit years here, couple 3 years between the two releases. And you'll hear Resident Evil talked about all day long. In Deep Fear, I could aim the gun and move. How long was it before you could do that in a Resident Evil?
yeah.
For the love of God, man, it's like, how can you talk about these games and prop these games up and not give Sega versions or Sega, similar Sega games at that time an equal amount of time explaining to people why they were successful? That's the sad reality of it, is we'll tell you how it really is, but how it should be is an entirely different conversation.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely. Go on,
it's
James.
it's like no, just it's almost as if because they don't make systems anymore, that they've almost become an irrelevance.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, their games don't matter because they don't make consoles anymore. They're old hat. They've had their time. But just because they stopped making systems doesn't make their games irrelevant. Like these are historically important. And I think that's the thing as well that we all try to do in getting people to maybe take a look at these games. And you couple that with like the mod community who are making these games so accessible. You know, you've got EverDrive carts, you've got your ODEs on the Saturn. I mean, it's ironic that the much or most maligned Sega system is the one which has got the most mod options. You know, there's an option for every budget. You know, you can have your satiator, which is your high end. Don't need to take a disk drive out, pop it in the back, no opening the console. Fenrir, you've even got Saru for the cartridge slot. These games are being made so easy to access. Like a Sega Saturn with a broken disk drive won't go for massive money. You pick one of those up if you're not interested in collecting. You pick one of those up. You spend £100 on a Fenrir. You've got access to it as whatever you like. You know, even with the Dreamcast, you don't have to spend £200 on a mod. You can go on AliExpress and spend £80 on a clone GDMU. Those have gone up big time. Those were like £25 like 3 years ago. They've gone up big time. But even at that, like Dave showed that video at Gamescom, and he was going through all the Saturn long box games that someone was selling, and it was like Doom, $120, Street Fighter Alpha 2, $140.
You
Bug
imagine
2,
spending $120 on Saturn Doom.
exactly. You know, and it's like people see that kind of stuff, and then they'll be like, "Oh my god!" That people that come to the Saturn after watching like our content, Shiro, would be like, why are you championing this system? It's so expensive, but it doesn't have to be. The options are there to experience these games, and that's why I think it's important that what we're doing is to try and get people to just pick up that controller, because, like you're saying, the character, like there's nothing like it. I can still hold the Saturn pad in my hand today, and I see that boot up screen, the boom, it just hits different. You know, it's like, not saying that games or systems that have come since are bad, but nothing like resonates. I think the closest console that's ever resonated with me the way the Saturn did is probably the Xbox 360. Like, I think that just had a real proper vibe to it. It just felt like even the OG Xbox was good, but the 360 just felt like everything that did, and then better. Plus, all the online stuff was just so streamlined, and it just had that vibe about it that it was so close to like that kind of perfect Sega feeling. But like, you sit there with that Saturn pad, man, it's just like you're playing these games, you're instantly taken back. And that's why, as I said, when we spoke to Nick when he was on our show, like Nick jokes that he was in nappies whenever Saturn came out. But he comes in and he can pick these games up and he looks at them with fresh eyes. And there's no judgment, there's no bias from the past. He just went in there with his own eyes, and the Saturn worked its magic. And that's what we need to try and get more people doing, is that, just as you said on the last Editor's Corner, no one should be talking about not just why the Saturn failed, or why Dreamcast failed. Just, that's all irrelevant. All that's left behind is the games. Just forget what the media said back then. Forget what people have been telling myths wise and whispers and rumors for 25, 30 years. Just play the games. If you don't want to spend a fortune, you don't have to. They're accessible. Just please play these games and just keep that legacy going.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I was gonna make a point on what you just said just now, James, about the when Sega stopped making consoles, the outlook changed. Just want to pick up on something. I don't know if either of you both saw it, but when Sega threw in the towel on the Dreamcast, obviously they moved over, they ported a number of Dreamcast games over to other consoles. And it felt like overnight the attitude towards those changed. I think the biggest one I mean, Crazy Taxi didn't review as well on the PS2, and I think that's because I don't think that's a very good port at all.
Shit.
Yeah, I know how you feel about it. But
Awful.
Sonic Adventure 2 was getting 8s and 9s out of 10s in every publication. It came to the GameCube, and all of a sudden, it was flat out 6 out of 10s. So, did the fact that Sega stopped making consoles steer the argument, steer the discussion around their output at the time? Was it suddenly that their games weren't ever as good as they were before? It's a weird one for me because even all these retrospective reviews, it does feel like they're reluctant to give these games plaudits, even when they had them back in the day. It feels like there's a pause to it.
Yeah, there may be something to that. Uh, you know, maybe maybe the biggest thing that you could probably take away from that is maybe Sega's problem was is that they were trying to port games to other systems, and you always know that when you try to port something, something changes, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like when you're bringing something and you're changing the hardware so that the game basically has to be rewritten, you know, from the ground up to meet those changes. And let's face it, the like when you're talking about something like Crazy Taxi, I mean, can you imagine trying to take something from the Dreamcast architecture and trying to get it running on that piece of shit PlayStation 2? I mean, for the love of God, man. I mean, PlayStation 2 games, it was like playing a game somebody had smeared Vaseline across the screen in comparison to the Dreamcast. I mean, let's be real.
Yeah.
Dreamcast games were ultra sharp. They were, VGA compatible. And then all of a sudden, I'm going to freaking RCA and S video cables to, on a PlayStation 2. But I don't know. I think Sega's problem may have been they kind of put themselves in company that had problems themselves bringing their games to other platforms, and that's just bringing games over, changing the architecture. It changes how the game looks, it changes how the game plays, or they'll do things to it. Sonic Adventure 2 is a good example because let's make it better, let's make it this and add stuff to it. And I don't know. It's just when Sega went third party, they probably should have left behind that legacy of games that they had in terms of trying to port things. And they just should have launched right into making entirely new games altogether. Because I think that probably would have given them more, you know, I mean, it would have been inspiration if anything else. It's like, well, we made Crazy Taxi on the Dreamcast. Let's make a different Crazy Taxi for the PlayStation 2. I mean, when you don't attempt to make better and you're just porting stuff, are you giving it your all? Are you doing your best job? Is it really what the customer wants to see? Did PlayStation 2 owners want to play Crazy Taxi? Because a lot of PlayStation 2 owners would have been Dreamcast owners the previous years, right? So they had already played the Dreamcast versions of these games, and then they're going to the PlayStation 2. They see Sega on the box, and what is it? It's the shit they've already played. And I think that psychologically that will affect the reviewer as well.
Yeah.
Because a reviewer's going to come into this and they're going to be like, wow, Sonic Adventure 2, I totally played this game 3 years ago, 4 years ago, whatever. It's like, it's not really better, totally not worth your money, 6.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's kind of what happens, isn't it? It's kind of like, oh, another one of these fucking games from Sega. Let's slap a middling review on it, call it a day, because we're going to get 3 more of these before the month is out. I don't know, man. There's a lot to unpack with that particular topic. And I think that's another area where timing was probably a thing too. It's like Sega waited too long to release those games on other systems. It's like, man, the Dreamcast versions were out like years before, and you're pretty much, where do you think those Dreamcast owners went after you canceled your system?
Yeah.
They went to the PlayStation 2, they went to the Xbox, but then you were bringing games over. Microsoft is disappointed with the Shenmue 2 sales, but Shenmue 2 was on the fucking Dreamcast. It's like they were just re-releasing the game. I don't know. It comes to a point where if you're going to make a step like that, you probably really do need to either come out with all new games or maybe bring forward games people didn't play just 2, 3, 4 years prior.
Yeah.
And you're right though, it probably does hurt the legacy of those games because it's kind of like, it's what I call it the Sonic effect with my friends. It's like, it's when you release something too much,
Yeah.
too much of a good thing. It's like when you get to a point where you're releasing something every year, every 2 years with some little increase, or it's in a compilation, people get sick of it. And I think that's kind of what happened there for that little stretch of time. It's like people are coming off that high of the Dreamcast with that disappointment of it failing, and they're rolling into these other next gen consoles. And what do they get? Mostly the same damn games.
I think you're spot on there actually, because a lot of that stuff was too late. You look at the most successful Sega games of that period, Virtua Fighter 4, Shinobi on the PS2, Panzer Dragoon Auto. Those were all brand new games and brand new IPs, and they did better than the ports did. Sonic Adventure 2 always is a strange one for me, and I'll bring that up because Battle was, it was only 6 months after the Dreamcast release, but people probably were already like, I played this 6 months ago. It's near enough identical. And then you had stuff like Sonic Adventure DX, which is an absolute abortion compared to the original Dreamcast game, which again hurts that legacy. And that's coming out. You've got Sonic 2 Battle, then you've got Sonic DX, and then you've got Shadow the Hedgehog, and then you're into that whole downturn of the Sonic's franchise. So yeah, I think you're spot on there, Mel.
One other little thing as well, taking a jump out of the back of that, the whole Dreamcast discontinuing. I don't know if, Mel, if you picked this kind of vibe up in the US media, but I remember an issue of Edge not long after Dreamcast got discontinued, and it was big blue cover with Sonic's face close up with the expression, all ready for battle, and the headline was Dreamcast finished, Sega unstoppable, right? And it was almost like the way I read it and the vibe I got from it was that the gaming media was almost celebrating that they no longer had to play Sega games on Sega. Like, we don't have to buy these failed systems to play these games. We're going to get them on the popular systems. It did feel like they were almost, oh, it's a shame that failed. But anyway, they're going to bring everything to everything else. And whenever we spoke to Peter Moore and we asked him about how the deal came around to get the games from Sega that they did get on the OG Xbox, why those particular games came across, and he actually said that Robbie Bach reached out to Peter Moore personally and said, and the way Peter put it was, how can we help? Now, Peter caveated that by saying, how can we help also meant you've got some really good IPs and we want them before someone else gets them. So, even Microsoft in their fledgling console moments recognise the importance of Sega. And I asked the question, so do you know why PlayStation got Virtua Fighter 4 and you guys didn't? Because you went all in on DOA, but what happened? And again, Peter said he didn't know the exact reason. He thinks it may have been a decision made by Yu Suzuki that he preferred to have, the Virtua Fighter stay on a kind of Japanese system. But he says he didn't know the actual answer. It might have been Yu Suzuki's decision. But it was interesting whenever he said that, it was Robbie Bach that reached out and it says, how can we help? Give us some good stuff. But that transitional period, it did feel like there was a celebration. Like, even as I said before, Jet Set Radio Future, I think, gets more praise than Jet Set Radio does. And Jet Set Radio on the Dreamcast is the far better game. Like Jet Set Radio Future is so dumbed down. Those tag mechanics for the spray paint are like, well, you just press the button as you go past it. But the Dreamcast, it was like, dare, your thumb's doing cartwheels trying to do these tags. So, that came to mind, that issue as you were talking about that kind of crossover. But did you feel, Mel, that kind of attitude was mirrored? Like, you don't have to buy these failing consoles anymore because the Sega stuff's coming to the popular ones.
Yeah, you know what it really felt like to me? It was kind of like these magazine editors were like, we've been sort of talking about the Dreamcast for a few years now. We've been throwing hints at you that this thing was not going to be what you thought it was. You dumbasses, it failed. It was almost like it was condescending in a way when they, when they would write their articles after Sega announced that the Dreamcast was being discontinued. These articles were written with almost this condescending, we told you so. We told you that this was going to happen. You know that the Sega Saturn failed. When the Dreamcast came out, the PlayStation 2 with its DVD and its super powerful technology was going to, be the be all end all of graphics. The writing was on the wall. We knew this was going to happen. And you kind of got that feeling like they were just saying Sega was effed the entire time. And this is finally, the nail in the coffin, the final nail in the coffin. It's over, and you look back on it, it kind of pissed you off a little bit because even with the Dreamcast being in the situation it did, I actually did a video on this too. I was still surprised that Sega completely abandoned the console industry. I mean, at the very least, I expected them to stay in that fight until the Dreamcast had run its course. I thought that you were looking at a good 5 years here. They were going to support this thing at least through 2003, 2004. To have them just abandon it, abandon their mainline platform like that. Wow, man, what does that do to your brand in the consumer's eye? I mean, you got to think, go back and look at every failed Sega system regionally. In the US, the Sega Master System was absolutely destroyed by the Nintendo Entertainment System. It wasn't even close. Sega released that here in 86, I think it was, supported it through 91. The Mega Drive in Japan got its ass handed to it by the PC Engine and the Super Famicom. Sega released it in 88, supported it through 94, 95. Sega CD released, supported for multiple years. Saturn released, supported for multiple years. The Dreamcast is their only mainline system where they just pulled the plug and said, we're done. It's over. Yeah. And they basically wrapped up what they had in development at the time, which came out that following year. And then that was it, man. So if you had bought a Sega Dreamcast on $99.99 or whatever the equivalent was for you guys in the UK, essentially, what did you have the system for before Sega said, we're done? A year and a half?
All right.
A little over a year? I mean, think about that for a second. That affects the legacy right there. Because you're talking about the Dreamcast sold, 9-10 million systems over the course of its life officially. Whatever those numbers actually are. You're talking about millions of people that bought that system, bought into that ecosystem, bought into that belief that they were going to get a system that runs 4 or 5 years before it's either replaced or then Sega bows out. That isn't what happened. Most of the people barely had a Dreamcast a year unless they imported it from Japan. They barely had that system any time when Sega basically said, okay, 2 Christmases are gone. You didn't buy enough software. We're out. And that's what happened. And that's a legacy killer right there, because you're basically taking 10 million Sega fans, and most of those people moved on. They moved on and they said, done. And I mean, you really have to factor that into, no matter how much it hurts us to say it, because we love the consoles, love the Sega CD. I mean, I don't know if you guys love the Mega CD over there, but I love the Sega
Yeah.
CD. I can't argue with someone who says that they felt burned by it in terms of what it brought to the table, because when you really look at it, Sega CD, 32X, ending the Dreamcast early, those really are legacy killers.
Mm-hmm.
Not only did it shorten up the library of those systems, but you got to think, man, not everybody, were super fans like us, where we could get the most out of a Sega system. We could wring that sucker dry of gameplay. Most people weren't like that. They would come in, they would buy a couple of games for the device, and then that was it. No more games come out. Not a lot of variety would come out. Sega's decisions with its system, I think, definitely impacts its legacy long term as much as anything else.
Yeah, I think so. And I think you see it a lot. And I know we talked earlier about how they hit the reset button on their franchises all the time, but I think the transition between the Saturn and the Dreamcast also hurt a lot of Western gamers, a lot of Western Saturn fans. As I've seen on, when there's been discussions around the Dreamcast, and there have been people that said after Sega didn't support the Saturn, I didn't buy a Dreamcast because I was done with Sega at that point. And I think for us, the Saturn never really died between the Saturn and the Dreamcast, because we were buying import games where the games were still coming out in Japan, and then I think we probably all imported our Sega Dreamcast. But if you're a Western Sega fan, and you guys didn't even get Deep Fear, the last Sega Saturn game comes out in the US middle of 1998, and then you've got this barren wasteland between like summer of 1998 and then September the following year, like 13 months with absolutely no Sega presence on the shelves whatsoever. And all of a sudden, I think that hurts the legacy as well, because it's like what Sega effectively threw in the towel on the Western Sega Saturn, and then disappeared for nearly a year and a quarter, and then came back and expected everyone to jump back in. And obviously, as the hardcore Sega fans that we were at the time, we never stopped loving Sega. We were importing, Sega Saturn games and Dreamcast games. But, someone that loved Sega in the West didn't import. They were kind of hung out to dry a little bit, weren't they?
Yeah, that's the weird thing about like Bernie Stoller as well. Well, obviously he came in, he's former Sony, and he comes in and the EGM interview, Saturn's not our future, boom, just no RPGs, boom. But then he inflicted essentially that wasteland on the Sega community. But then he comes out and he's so bullish and passionate about like the Dreamcast. And I always felt that Bernie had a real grudge towards the Saturn when he came in. Like, it wasn't his product. He was a rival essentially, and he just did not. It was almost like he just could not wait to kill it off. But in a way, his business decision, excuse me, led to part of the kind of the Dreamcast's failure. Like, obviously, it had that most profitable entertainment history launch ever. Just shy of, was it 90 odd million or something? It made just shy of.
Yeah.
But he really, in a way, helped contribute to that by inflicting that total wasteland, that 13-month spell where you had no Sega presence, no brand can survive. Not even, I don't even think Apple. Can you imagine if Apple just decided to not make any more iPhones, iPads, watches, MacBooks, anything for like 13 months? Every competitor would be going, it's like they're not there, they're not a presence. People want new things. Technology moves so fast that people naturally, being inquisitive, will look elsewhere. So that's what happened. And it's just bizarre that, for him to come in and just kill off the Saturn the way he did, but yet then come out so bullishly passionate about Dreamcast whenever it's like, yeah, you're asking people to remember you, but you inflicted this amnesia, Sega amnesia that he caused by just not having a presence. It's just baffling decision.
There's something. It's. I don't think people realize how bad that downtime was either.
Yep.
Let me tell you from my perspective. This is what happened in the United States in 1997. Towards the end of the year, last few months of the year, Sega Saturn releases began to dry up. And if you went into a game store like Software Etc. or Babbage's or any of those kinds of stores, they would have these release lists, and you would look on them because you wanted to see the dates of what was coming out. Well, all of a sudden, you'd flip the page to the Saturn, and the Saturn had this little block of like 3, 4, 5 games that were coming out in like the next 8 months. And this was in 97. So I submit to you, this is what a lot of people don't understand about that downtime. They look at it from the release of Magic Knight Rayearth. It was way worse than that because it really started towards the end of 1997. And the releases slowed down to nothing, to where there was barely anything to buy. So that when 1998 hit, you had these games that were spaced out, but there were only what in 1998? 5 releases, 6 releases that entire year?
Yeah.
So really what you're looking at is that downtime really started way back in the end of 97. So it was more like a genuine 2 years where either Sega was completely barren of anything on the market, to where their Saturn had basically died, and what was coming out had been moved from the main system rack and put as end caps at the end of the aisles. The Saturn had no retail presence from the end of 97 forward. That's 2 years, buddy. 2 years. I mean, really think about that for a second.
Jeez.
But and just to end on that note about Bernie, Stoller. Bernie had a tough job when he came into Sega. I don't think I mean, God rest his soul, man. He's gone now. But can you imagine if somebody puts you in a position like that with the company you work with, where it had been a complete shit show of financial failure, and you're coming into it with a brand new idea? How much respect would you heap onto the failure?
Yeah, I suppose that. And I mean, I suppose you look at the Leak 97 docs, the fiscal year 97, that dossier is probably what Bernie was handed when he walked in the door. It was like, let's have a look at what's happening here. Holy shit. It's like... Oh, man.
Oh, so I've got a couple more points. I was going to talk about the hardware innovations, but I'm conscious that we're like nearly 2 hours already, and we probably go on for another hour if we dug into the hardware. But but one note I've got on here, given everything that we've talked about, is part Sega's legacy undoubtedly first and foremost is the games. Undoubtedly, just as you said, Mel. There are so many classic games that I've forgotten about, people that haven't played. You gave Deep Fear as a great example. That's a game that no one ever talks about, which is it's perhaps not quite Resident Evil level, but it's damn close. And it's got so many innovations that just make it stand out. So primarily Sega's Legacy is the games, but also is Sega's Legacy kind of a cautionary tale? You know, how not to handle a system, you look at something like you look at the way that Sega handled the Dreamcast and the Sega Saturn compared to how Nintendo handled the Wii U, which was a commercial failure, which sold similar numbers to the Sega Saturn and Dreamcast. I think it's something like 11 million to their 9 to 10 million. But by the same token, they supported that thing from 2012 all the way until 2017, despite it not selling, despite the console not selling, they continued to furnish that thing with software. And I think is that as much as we love Sega's output, we loved their hardware innovations, we loved, the peripherals, we loved the add-ons, as much as divisive as the 32X is, and as flawed as their handling of the Mega CD was, there was some good that came out of that, and they were obviously forward thinking in a way. And we love all that sort of stuff, but is part of Sega's console legacy also that cautionary tale?
Yeah, I definitely think that's a really good point. And, as content creators, that's one thing that we really need to be careful of. We need to be careful to, we will extol the virtues of the software, but we have to be careful not to try to rewrite the history
Yeah.
of Sega. The fact of the matter is, man, is no matter how much you love the games, no matter how many great memories the systems gave you, you have to face the reality that Sega did some things that really caused many of its problems. And as a fan, the worst thing you can do is ignore them or try to rewrite it to make it sound like it didn't matter as much or it shouldn't have mattered as much. You don't have to talk about the failure in terms of, harping on it constantly the way some places love to do. But at the same time, focus your energy on these games were great, regardless of how some of them sold. Some of them sold poorly because of the decisions that Sega made. You know, don't misunderstand or don't misconstrue game quality with company legacy. And I mean, when I make my content, it's the reason why I always try to give you multiple views, because the way I grew up, and I really think this really helped my view of gaming so much. I had two friends that I grew up with that were diehard Sega guys, man. And they were the guys that were like importing with me and loving games with me. But I also had two really good friends who were straight Nintendo guys. So I had this constant exposure to not only that Sega fandom, but that Nintendo fandom, and I really kind of got to, see both sides of it. And I got to see it for years and I got to see it develop. I got to see my Sega friends, and I was with them on this, trying to do everything in our power to make the 32X sound like it was this great idea. Whereas my Nintendo guys or my Nintendo friends, they were off to the side going, so you're gonna pay $100 and some dollars to get games that look like Super Nintendo games then? And it's kind of like, you wanted to smack them, but there was an ounce of truth to what they were saying. It's like I was always being exposed to these two sides, these varying opinions, man. And I hope that has come across the content that I create, because I try to make content that is like, I try not to just bang the Sega drum so loud it tries to drown out what really happened.
Yeah.
And really, when it really comes down to it, Sega made some pretty damn big mistakes. There's no doubt it affected them then, and in ways it still affects them now for their legacy. And of course, they continue to make mistakes with that legacy by re-releasing the same shit that they've always already released multiple times, not delving into their catalog of games. I mean, the you could go on and on when you talk about these mistakes. I mean, why did Deep Fear only have one game in it? Why wasn't there a Deep Fear 2? You're right. Deep Fear wasn't as good as the original Resident Evil, but it had all these cool little things about it. Why wasn't it elevated with a Deep Fear 2 on the Dreamcast, where maybe it would have been as good as a Resident Evil title with all these extras with it? Sega never did things to help itself out. And
Aye.
you really have to like remember that. Don't cover it up. You don't gotta harp on it. You don't gotta, make it your main point. But at the same time, like, be real. Let people know that it's the games that are is what's left. Does the legacy matter in the long run? Not really, because there's going to be people that listen to us and go, hey, let me go try this game and see if it's any good. But you're not going to change the mind of the people that have no interest in Sega.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
that legacy is already made, man. We can try, we can fight the good fight, but in the end, you're not going to win.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And that kind of brings us full circle because the final point I've got on here, and I think it's one that you've already made right at the beginning of the discussion, Mel, is that where does the legacy live on? It lives on with us as content creators. It lives on with people that are still playing Sega today. And it lives on with the modern community. Some of the stuff that we see coming out of the modern community is absolutely insane. And I think as long as there are people that do love it, that legacy will continue to live on. And hopefully we can inspire future generations. And maybe Sega one day will pull its finger out of its arse and start showing people what its back catalogue really is made of.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, that's where the legacy lives on, isn't it? With the fans, with guys like us, and with the modern community who just do some absolutely spectacular stuff and are still bringing out new translations and new mods and new games. And in that sense, it's the scene is looking pretty healthy at the moment, I think.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of one of those things where how can a system that was maligned for so long be so incredibly popular today? I mean, that really tells a lot how good those games were. You can argue legacy all you want, but it's the strength of those games that keep that system so relevant now, where it's fans are willing to learn how to program for it so that they can translate games they always wanted to play or make games from the ground up that they always wanted to make. And I don't know, man, like there was something special about Sega. And whether or not that legacy lives on, whether or not that legacy is respected, I mean, like you say, man, it's up to guys like us, the people that continue to play those games, love those games, to just keep pushing that love out there into the ether. And, hopefully it gets picked up here and there. And, that legacy lives on, man.
Yeah, that's right. I've got to radiate that passion and hope that it catches on. If we
Exactly.
can.
Exactly.
And that's
Brilliant.
that is the thing as well. Like that recent, the Sega Extreme, the 29th anniversary Sega Saturn homebrew competition, and I was on the judging panel for that, and like the quality of some of the games, like Slide Hop, Cold Case, which won. Delighted for Jay Beretta that Cold Case won, like, because the second I played that, I was like, people kept on going, oh, it's got Silent Hill vibes, and I'm like, why is no one mentioning the fact that it literally takes inspiration not just from Silent Hill, but from the medium? Like, you walk out of that bathroom, you look in the mirror, you hit investigate, and then you're inside the mirror in a dirty, manky version of that bathroom. You zoom out, you rotate that camera, you see both realities. I'm like, this guy's tried to take like a current generation PC console game like the medium and bring that element into a Saturn game with dual worlds. It was just crazy. The standard was just unbelievable, not just with the kind of original games, but like the translation stuff like Danthrax and the team behind Stellar Assault SS, like proper professional sounding voice acting, just unbelievable. And as we've said, you look back maybe what 2-3 years and you compare that to now, the standard that we're seeing, what are we going to see for the 30th anniversary competition next year and beyond? That's what excites me the most, that people are still that passionate about, especially the Saturn, which I think has got the biggest homebrew scene in terms of just innovation. Like that's what excites me. Where is that passion for this system going to take it? Like, what are we going to see? Like if Frogbill can give us a playable demo of his Metal Gear Solid, that would be great. I'd love to try that, but it's exciting, and I think that is that even a system that failed, has had such an impact on people, even people who weren't there to experience it when it was new, that it makes them want to learn how to code for it, create tools to make developing for it easier. That's an important legacy, I think, that's been left behind as well.
Yeah.
I think that's a great place to end it. Mel, thanks so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure once
Thank you,
again. If you want to tell, I'm sure that everyone that's watching this knows where to find you, but for posterity, where can they find you?
Well, I've said it before. I'm not really a social media guy, but I'm on YouTube, Sega Lord X, cover, everything Sega that's relevant to me, what I like. I try not to spam everybody with buy this, that, and the other through my channel. I just try to make that, like you say, man, I try to radiate the Sega love and put it out there. But yeah, I really appreciate you guys having me on. These conversations are always fantastic.
It's
Oh,
been an
thank you,
absolute
Mel.
pleasure. Thank you very much. And yeah, so viewers, listeners, hope you've enjoyed that. Get in touch what you think of Sega's Legacy, whether it's on the Sega Guys Discord, the Radio Sega Discord, or via the comments below. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy this content. And if you want to be extra mega, you can become a member, which starts from as little as 99p. And James, could you let us know who we support in today's episode?
Yes, our premium members are Andy Mackey, Sega Saturn Lad, G-Man Stiff Peaks, we have I Am Mikowski, we have Craig Williamson, we have also Resident SD who joined us for 1 month, and our good friends, as always, the crew at Sega Saturn Shiro. So thank you very much to all our members and subscribers for your continued support. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you very much. And even if you haven't liked or subscribed and you're just here for the ride, we really appreciate you as well, just for being with us and sharing that Sega love. So until next time, we will see you on the Sega side.
Pick up.